Welcome back, dear friends, to the fourth episode of the Elder Scrolls lore series. Join me today as we journey through the events that gave shape to the First Era, so called for being the first officially recorded time period in Nirn's long and turbulent history. With the conclusion of the legendary Merithic era, shrouded in mystery and speculation, we enter the first somewhat chronologically accurate period known as the First Age. Almost 3,000 years in length, this era is defined by the shifting of power between the elven and human races, the rise and fall of powerful nations, and cataclysmic events of incomprehensible proportion. The timeline officially begins with the establishment of the Kingdom of Valenwood and the Cameron dynasty by King Eblier, who accomplished the impossible task of uniting the scattered clans of Wild Bosmer, an offshoot of the Ealdmeri who settled in Valenwood long before the beginning of the First Age. These wild elves chose to reject the stiff, formal traditions of Ealdmeri high culture, preferring a more simple existence in harmony with the land and nature. These Bosmer are said to have been some of the first original Old Elnofey to leave Ealdmeris, and after adapting to the challenges of the forests of Valenwood, and some rumored intermingling with humans, emerged as an entirely new people. The Aelids of central Tamriel were all too happy to use this new kingdom as a buffer between themselves and the influence of their original homeland, the Somerset Isles, eventually declaring their independence. The 13th year of the 2nd century of the First Era marks the birth of Harold, also known as Harald Hanfrey, who would become the first historically recognized king of the Nords. Despite being the 13th monarch descending from Ysgramor himself, he would earn his title by completely driving out the Snow Elves from the northern part of the continent and consolidating his holdings as Skyrim, a new independent kingdom with the city of Windhelm being the capital. As for the Snow Elves, or the Falmer in their own tongue, that originally inhabited the north of Tamriel, they made their last stand in the Battle of Mosring. After an intense skirmish, their leader, the Snow Prince, was slain, and the elves were routed. The age of the Snow Elves was over, and the survivors sought shelter within the underground cities of their only remaining allies, the Dwemer. The Dwemer, however, betrayed their elven kin and forced them first into servitude and then into outright slavery, blinding them with a diet of toxic fungus. Thus, the once proud Snow Elves became the twisted forms of the Falmer that, to this day, terrorize Skyrim's subterrane. Now, as for the triumphant Harold and his descendants, they pressed on with their conquests, steadily expanding into other regions of Tamriel. In the south, the Nords challenged the powerful Aelids and seized a portion of Nibene Valley. To the west, they forced the mighty Direni, an influential elven clan from much of the region now known as High Rock. The arrival of the Nordic conquerors upended the existing balance of power between the native Nedic humans and the elves, though the Direni would retain significant influence for generations and eventually seek to regain their lost power. In the east, a brutal campaign subdued the fragmented, nomadic Chimer, culminating in Skyrim's domination of all of present-day Morrowind. In the early years of the 3rd century, following the death of King Harald, the Dwemer clans that inhabited Skyrim discovered a large deposit of raw aetherium in a massive subterranean cavern known as the Black Reach. Aetherium is an exceptionally rare crystal that holds formidable magical qualities. An alliance between 4 Dwemer cities of Arkenthams, Ralbathar, Mezovt, and Bathar Zel was created to oversee the extraction, processing, and study of the rare crystal. Eventually, this cooperation culminated in the construction of the Aetherium Forge under the city of Bethalft, which was successful in refining the Aetherium into artifacts of incredible power. With the project's success, driven by their insatiable greed, the Dwarven Alliance shattered almost immediately, as the 4 city-states and their rivals attempted to claim the forge for themselves. The conflict later became known as the Aetherium Wars, and it lasted for several decades. These years of internal disputes and infighting decimated Skyrim's Dwemer, and was the primary reason for their collapse, until the weakened city-states, much like the other parts of northern Tamriel, fell to the expansionist conquests of the Nords. Inspired by the success of their fellow humans against the elves in the north, the enslaved Nedic population of the Aelid-dominated Cyrodiil saw the possibility of doing the same to their own rulers. At this time, the Aelid power structure was deeply fragmented, with numerous independent kingdoms and city-states fighting for dominance, all while a not insignificant minority within the Aelid nobility began to sympathize with the human struggle. The Needs would take advantage of this period of elven civil war and instability, and would rise in a rebellion under the leadership of Saint Alessia, the so-called Slave Queen. Little is known of Alessia's birth and early life. As a human slave in Cyrodiil, the heartland of the Aelid Empire, where mankind knew no freedom, any record of her original tribe, family, or given names was erased. It is known, however, that it was with divine intervention did Alessia start her uprising. While the Aelids generally worshipped the Altmeri pantheon and dealt frequently with the Daedric princes, the Nords of Skyrim worshipped a distinct group of gods, much more sympathetic to humanity. It is to these gods that Alessia began to pray for assistance in freeing her people. Kynareth, or Kine, one of the 8 divines, and the goddess of the heavens, the winds, and the sea, answered Alessia's pleas with a vision given to her at Sancre Tor, which in Aelid translates to Golden Hill. Legends have it that Kine was the first to agree to Lorkhan's plan to create the mortal plane, and is credited with breathing life into the world from the top of the throat of the world. The compassionate deity sent her son, the Nordic demigod hero Morrowind, to advise and aid Alessia. Rumored to later having become her lover, Morrowind helped Alessia to rally the other slaves to her cause. Kine continued to support Alessia, with one of her visions revealing another legendary figure of the First Era, the infamous crusader Pelinal Whitestrake. Who this character was is a topic much debated within the academic community. It is said that he first appeared during the previous Merithic era and wandered Tamriel gathering armies, conquering lands and ruling them, all to then abandon his kingdoms and wander once again. Some say that he was a Padmeic spirit, sent by Lorcan himself to aid mankind, while others claim that he descends from Akatosh, the chief deity among the 8 divines, as he often is depicted with the dragon god's symbology on his chest. What is agreed upon is Perenel's undying hatred for the elves, and he would become Alessia's greatest champion and the leader of her armies in their rebellion against the Mer. The king of Skyrim was quick to join the needed rebellion, and together the combined human armies quickly began to drive the Aelids out of the populated regions of Cyrodiil, toppling their strongholds and being joined by more and more liberated slaves. Perenel Whitestrake, in particular, became legendary for his brutal decimation of the Aelid armies and kings, challenging many Aelid rulers to duels and disposing of them in the most brutal fashion. The rebels' strategy was to drive the Aelids inward towards the White Gold Tower, forcing them into increasingly smaller circles around Lake Rumer. Eventually, the human armies would reach and lay siege to the White Gold Tower itself, the center of the Aelid power. The Alessian armies and the Nords grew anxious and fearful at the foresight of storming the fortified and well-garrisoned tower, and Alessia herself counseled delay, angering the impatient Perenel. The demigod leader of the Aelids, Umaril the Unfeathered, used Whitestrake's irritation to his advantage, challenging the Crusader to a duel. Perenel would prevail and defeat Umaril, but himself was brutally slain by the remaining Aelid sorcerer kings. It is said that his body was cut into 8 pieces, a symbolic number in Aelid culture. Driven by Perenel's final screams, Alessia and her council ordered an immediate attack on the city, only to find the majority of the defenders already defeated by the Crusader or fleeing for their lives. After years of fighting, the human armies finally took control of the White Gold Tower itself, ending forever the reign of the Aelid in Tamriel. Thus began the First Empire of Cyrodiil, with Alessia being crowned the first empress. The worship of the 8 divines was instated as an official religion, fusing together elements of Aelid and Nordic deities. As it so often is in history, the years of stability would not last. The 4th century is defined by the rise of the Direni, a powerful elven clan within the human-controlled province of High Rock. Through political maneuvering and questionable machinations, the Direni were able to consolidate the other elven noble families under their rule and push back against the Nords, who had previously annexed almost the entire region in the preceding century. The Direni achieved great success in their military actions against the humans, even with the Nords being supported by the armies from the newly founded Alessian Empire. As more and more of High Rock was lost to the Direni, xenophobic sentiments within the empire would rise, and the remaining Aelid lords that continued to rule parts of the empire as vassals to the Elysian monarchs would eventually be driven out by the increasingly fanatical humans. The Direni would see even greater success when the Empire of the Nords began to collapse upon itself, unable to defend its outlying territories, just as the disunified Aelids before them were defeated by the rebelling slaves in the century past. History violently repeating itself and rhyming the same bloody verse. The catalyst for this collapse was the death of High King Borgas, the last of Ysgramor's descendants, who, while traveling to Cyrodiil to urge a joint war against Valenwood, was assassinated by the Wild Hunt, a group of monstrously transformed Bosmer. The Council of Nords, known as the Moot, failed to elect a new High King, plunging Skyrim into the decades of the War of Succession and signaling the loss of the First Nordic Empire's united leadership and the waning of its power and influence in Tamriel, never again regaining its former glory. This civil conflict would eventually end in the 5th century with the signing of the Pact of Chieftains that would name Olaf One-Eye, the legendary Jarl of Whiterun that defeated and imprisoned the dragon Numinex as the new High King of Skyrim. During the turbulent succession crisis in the north, Indaril Nerevar, the Hortator, or Great Ashkan, united the scattered Khmer people and forged an alliance with King Dumak of the Dwemer through their personal friendship. This union was crucial for the Khmer in their struggle for independence, as the Nords had never been able to conquer the mighty underground Dwemer cities that had essentially stayed independent despite the Nordic invasion of the region. The two leaders joined their formerly opposed people against the occupying forces of the Nords and eventually drove them out of Veloth, or present-day Morrowind. The alliance formally became known as the First Council, and the newly named land of Resdain was established as a united Khmer and Dwemer kingdom, with Nerevar and Dumak as its joint leaders. Peace between the Khmer and Dwemer brought an unprecedented prosperity and flowering to both cultures. Not all the Dwemer were so accepting of the alliance with their ancient enemies. Rurkin, a clan of the Dwemer, refused peace with the Khmer. Choosing instead self-imposed exile, they departed Resdain forever. Eventually, the Rurkin went westwards, traversing the green forests of Cyrodiil, until they reached an area in modern-day fiefdom of Tegonus, where they established the kingdom of Volenfell, or Hammerfell, as it is now known. According to ancient legend, the leader of the Rurkin hurled the mighty hammer Volendrong across Tamriel, vowing to lead his clan to wherever it landed, thus giving the province its name. The waning years of the 5th century are defined by civil conflict within the Alessian Empire itself, as well as between the Empire and the unlikely alliance of Skyrim and Direni forces, each of whom sought to reject the overwhelming Alessian influence. The events leading to disaster began when the Alessian kingdom of Skinbrad, a fiercely independent state, although owing allegiance to the imperial White Gold Tower, suffered a succession crisis. when most of its royal family succumbed to a devastating plague that swept across Cyrodiil. The surviving heir immediately ceded control to the empire, for which he was confronted and then executed by his younger brother, a man history would come to know as Rislav the Righteous. This sparked open battle between the United Kingdoms of Skingrad and Kavach against the Alessian Empire, led by Emperor Gorius. Through superior tactics and well-positioned archers, Rislav was able to prevail, crippling the imperial forces. The defeat of the imperial legions and the diminishing power of the Alessian Empire incited unrest in other regions that reluctantly underwent strong Alessian influence, such as Skyrim and the Dirani holdings. For years at this point, the Nords and Imperials were engaged in territorial skirmishes along the border that eventually grew into full-scale war, with the Battle of Sungard, where the High King of Skyrim, Keurig the White, was slain by Emperor Gorius. Although the battle was a loss for Skyrim, they would eventually have their revenge years later with the Battle of Glenumbra Moors, where Keurig's son, Hoag Mercular, joined the Direni hegemony against the Alessians. The Direni, seeing the defeat of Gorius at the hands of Rislav of Skindrad, saw weakness in the empire and outlawed Alessian teachings and doctrines within their lands. The Imperials pushed into High Rock at this provocation, but suffered a series of defeats at the hands of the Elves. These defeats culminated in an area known as Glenumbra Moors, where the forces of the Direni, with the last vestiges of the Aeles and the very unlikely Nord allies, met the Alessians in a grand battle. Although a decisive victory for the Direni, the battle resulted in negative long-term consequences for all involved. The Alessian order was expelled from High Rock and fell into decline, while the Direni themselves were weakened to such an extent by the battle that they were mostly driven from the province by the emerging Breton nobility by the next century. In Resdayn, having defeated the Nords and hence deprived of a common goal, tensions started to rise between the Chimer and the Dwemer. Several accounts attribute the war that followed to simple cultural or religious differences between the Dwemer and the Chimer, but the true cause of war was House Dagoth bringing news to the Chimer that the Dwemer had discovered an item of tremendous power beneath the Red Mountain. This artifact was known as the Heart of Lorcan, and indeed, true to its name, it was the manifestation of the divine spark taken from the trickster god as punishment during the Dawn era and cast into the depths of Nirn. The heart landed in present-day Morrowind, the impact forming the Red Mountain, a volcanic mountain of immense size. Upon the discovery of the heart, Kagranak, the high priest and chief engineer of the Dwemer, began studying ways to tap into its power in his search for the secrets of immortality, and to create a new artificial god known as Numidium that would allow the Dwemer people as a whole to transcend mortal existence. This led to heated negotiations between Nerevar and Dumak Dwarf King. Upon being told by the Daedric Prince Azura that the Dwemer were building a new god under the mountain, Nerevar and the Tribunal, a group of his closest advisors, issued an ultimatum to the Dwemer to stop their blasphemy or face destruction. Dumak, unaware of the full extent of the work Kagranak had done to the heart, refused. and so the Chimer and the Dwemer went to war. With the Chimer and the Dwemer fighting among themselves, the Nords either saw an opportunity to regain their old dominions and invaded, or were invited to participate in the war by one of the belligerents. The exact events of the war are unknown, as there are various conflicting accounts of what happened. All accounts agree, however, that the war culminated with the Battle of the Red Mountain. Accounts of this final battle vary, with some stating that the battle was either the last stand of the Dwemer, a site where the Chimer and Dwemer armies simply met in pitched battle, or even a massive clash between the Chimer-Dwemer alliance and the Nordic invaders, led by King Wulfharth. During the battle, the Dwemer king Dumak was confronted by Nerevar and his companions in the chamber that stored the heart beneath the Red Mountain. Again, the accounts of what transpired are conflicting at best. Dumak was slain, precisely by whom is to this day uncertain. Some say it was the Nordic king Wulfharth. Others say it was at Nerevar's hands that the dwarf king fell. Sources are similarly unclear as to whether Nerevar himself was killed during this battle, died from his wounds after, or was murdered by his own closest companions, the Tribunal, while invoking the help of the Daedric Prince Azura. As for Wulfharth, if he had been in the battle at all, he either died at the Heart's Chamber after being weakened by Dumak and slain by Indoril Nerevar, or blasted away into ashes by Vivek of the Tribunal. All sources agree, however, that it was at this point that the entire race of the Dwemer, including those exiled to Volenfell, disappeared from Nirn entirely, as Cagwanac used his magical tools on the Heart in a desperate last attempt to save his people. After the battle, Sothasil, one of the Tribunal and Nerevar's former mentor, acquired an understanding of how the tools of Cagwanac and the Heart of Lorcan worked, and thus how to use them to turn both himself and the other two members of the Tribunal, Vivek and Almalexia, into living gods. The Tribunal then went through the process of stealing its divine essence for themselves. Sothasil then further angered the Daedric Prince Azura by saying that they no longer needed the Daedra, as the Tribunal were the new gods of the Chimer people. Azura appeared before them and cursed them for their sacrilege and their betrayal of Nerevar, claiming that she will use her power to resurrect him one day and permanently transforming their entire race. The Chimer's golden skin turned ashen and their eyes a fiery red, thus transforming them into the present-day Dunmer. On the other side of Nirn, to the west of Tamriel, the continent of Yokuda, the homeland of the legendary sword singers, was sinking into the depths of the sea. This cataclysm is said to have been caused by the Hiradirge, loyalist followers of Emperor Hira, and the losing side of a brutal civil war. Being defeated by the aforementioned sword singers, mythical warriors who devoted their life to the study of the blade, the Hiradirge, well versed in so-called stone magic, took their revenge by unleashing forbidden techniques capable of devastating entire continents. The surviving sword singers, led by the famous hero Frandar Hunding, left Yokuda and set sail for Hammerfell in a wave of migration called the Ragada, or the warrior wave in their own tongue. Over the centuries, the term Ragada would eventually become warped into Red God, the name by which these people are known as today. The Ragada would drive out the native orcs and Needs of Hammerfell to claim the region as their own, and would bring with them the traditions of honorable combat to Cyrodiil by way of the legendary blade master Gaiden Shinji, and the now famous arena would be constructed in the Imperial City. The desperate orc and goblin tribes, fleeing the invading Redguards, journeyed towards the nearly uninhabitable region in the western Wulfgarian mountains, close to High Rock. There lay a magnificent stone city known as Orsinium. Initially started as nothing more than a refugee camp in the early First Era by various beast folk fleeing from the Aldmeri under the leadership of Chief Torog, the orcish clans carved and shaped Orsinium from the very mountains around them. Far from their enemies, the camp grew into a village, and the village expanded into a town. Eventually, massive stone walls were raised around the sprawling city of Orsinium that would endure for centuries. Having their army bolstered by the fleeing Hammerfell refugees, the orcs sought to expand into the territories of High Rock. The King Joil of the Breton kingdom of Daggerfall sent a letter to Gaiden Shinji, the Grand Master of the Order of Diagna, an order of sword singers, seeking aid in repelling the orcish raiders. They were joined by the forces of the newly formed Redguard kingdom of Sentinel and laid siege to Orsinium. The siege would last for an entire 30 years, with the city eventually falling and being razed to the ground. In the events following the razing of Orsinium, the Breton king Joil would betray the Redguards, resulting in Gaiden Shinji's death, and he would invade Hammerfell. He would be unsuccessful, having met his death at the hands of the sword singers. The phenomenon that occurred at the onset of the 13th and lasting 1008 years to the 23rd century of the First Era challenges mortal comprehension. Known as the Middle Dawn or the Dragon Break, in reference to the dragon god of time Akatosh, it broke time itself, as cultists from the Alessian Order attempted to tamper with the divine essence of Akatosh himself. During this catastrophic disruption of linearity, the natural timeline separates, which results in branching parallel realities where the same events occur differently, or not at all. This results in a return to the non-linear timeline, akin to the very first Dawn era. At the end of the Dragon Break, the timeline reconnects, making all possibilities and outcomes true, yet contradictory to each other, thus making the very idea of historical records for this millennium impossible. Time resumes its flow in the 23rd century, with the onset of the so-called Thracian Plague, an artificially created pandemic of mass proportions that was released on Tamriel by the Slod-like Slode, the necromantic denizens of the coral kingdoms of Thras, west of Tamriel. The plague devastated the continent, with some estimating that as much as half of Tamriel's population perished, while the Slode raided the coastline, sacking cities and enslaving the population. The plague had major political and cultural repercussions on Tamriel, the most notable of which was the unprecedented alliance of almost all the nations of Western Tamriel in the face of the Slode menace, and the assembling of the All Flags Navy, led by Bendu Olo, the Baron Admiral and Bicalovian King of Anvil. The All Flags Navy sailed to Thras, slaughtered all the Slode that they could find, and with great unknown magics, sunk their coral kingdoms to the bottom of the sea. It would take many years before Thrace was restored to its former glory, and its population never attempted any similar attack on Tamriel again. In Cyrodiil, in the years following the All-Flags Navy's victory over the Sload, the triumphant western Colovian estates began to overshadow the eastern capital region of Nibene, the heart of the empire. With the priesthood of the Alessian Order no longer able to fully control the empire as a whole, tensions rose when the Colovian Count of Skinbrad planned an arranged marriage with the Bretonnian Queen of Wayrest. Fearing a dynastic alliance between High Rock and Calovia, Archprelate Xerneas forbade the union and eventually sent out his legions to punish the Colovians after his decree was ignored. The localized uprisings and minor skirmishes that were initially contained within the Colovian estates would spiral and turn into a decade of full-scale civil war that ended with the final dissolution of the Alessian Order and Cyrodiil splitting into eastern and western halves that continued to diverge culturally over the following years. It wasn't for centuries that Cyrodiil would unite again under Emperor Riemann I. His birth and early life remain shrouded in myth and speculation, but the man that would become the founder of the largest empire that Tamriel has ever seen would rise to prominence when the continent was invaded by the Seishi armies of Akavir. The years preceding the invasion saw an increase of Akaviri pirate activities, which were later understood to be scouting parties for future incursions. In the years following, the main Akaviri force made landfall in northern Skyrim, swiftly overwhelming Nordic defenses and spreading their invasion across the entire region. As the Akaviri advanced with little resistance, Riemann succeeded in uniting the splintered provinces of Calovia and Nibene under his command. Riemann led his forces northward to confront the invaders, constructing an extensive network of fortifications throughout Skyrim on his way. His coalition would soon be joined by the armies of Morrowind, whose territory also faced imminent danger, and by the Kingdom of Daggerfall, which played a crucial role in defending High Rock. Riemann's campaign reached its climax at the Battle of Pale Pass, where the Akaviri invaders were ultimately defeated. In the lead-up to the battle, Riemann had learned that the Akaviri forces were preparing to cross the Jural Mountains into Cyrodiil. Rumors suggested that their commanders were stationed in a hidden outpost within Pale Pass, which Riemann planned to isolate from the main army. Unbeknownst to him, a massive avalanche had already sealed the outpost, trapping the Akaviri leadership and leaving their army stranded and leaderless within the pass. As Riemann readied his offensive, Vivek, one of Morrowind's tribunal gods, also moved into position, cutting off the Akaviri from the north. Surrounded and disorganized, the Akaviri surrendered en masse to Riemann after a short engagement. According to legend, the Akaviri warriors, upon hearing Riemann's voice, recognized him as Dragonborn, the prophesied figure that they had been seeking, and knelt before him in submission. Impressed by their skill and weaponry, and wary of the threat that the elves posed to his new kingdom, Riemann welcomed the Akaviri into his ranks. They would go on to compose the core of his military and play a pivotal role in the foundation and rise of the Riemann dynasty, as well as forming the Dragon Guard, the Emperor's loyal and personal bodyguard. Following his victory at Pale Pass, the loose beginnings of the Second Empire started to come together, initially consisting of Cyrodiil, Skyrim, and High Rock, Riemann would take advantage of the aftermath of the Thracian plague and invade and conquer Valenwood without much resistance. The emperor deposed the long-lasting Cameron dynasty and split Valenwood between various smaller nobles, known as tree thanes, such that they would be divided enough to not challenge his rule. Riemann would later die at the hands of the Morag Tong, the Morrowind Guild of Assassins, and would go on to be worshipped as a god by his subjects. He was succeeded by his less than competent son Kastav, whose rule was blemished by constant harassment and extortion of his vassals, so much that even the loyal Dragon Guard would come to disobey his direct orders. Under unclear circumstances, Kastav was deposed and exiled, being replaced on the throne by Riemann II, grandson of the first Riemann. Emperor Riemann Cyrodiil II began his reign by swiftly and bloodlessly ending the feud and making amends with the vassals previously angered by his predecessor. This diplomatic and sensible approach would define the years of his reign and would usher in an era of prosperity and unprecedented power for the Second Empire. Riemann would go on to ban necromancy and Daedra worship both within the empire, bringing further stability to the realm. During his reign, the empire saw notable developments in art under the patronage of Emperor Riemann II. He notably permitted the construction of Alduin's Wall within Skyhaven Temple in Skyrim. It is regarded as one of the most well-preserved examples of early Akaviri sculptural relief and a marvel of the ancient world. Created to document the Dragon Guard's accumulated knowledge of dragon lore and prophecy, its central feature is a pictorial depiction of the prophecy of the Dragonborn. This prophecy foretells 5 major historical events that would precede the return of Alduin following his banishment during the Dragon War. Believing Alduin's return to be inevitable, the Dragon Guard saw the wall as their legacy, a gift to guide the future generations. Riemann would continue to display his martial acumen in the expansion of the Second Empire, conquering Hammerfell and the Khajiit kingdoms to the south. The Somerset Isles too fell to the humans, although many sources claim that the Altmer outright surrendered to the much more powerful empire to avoid bloodshed. It is worth noting that whenever a new territory would be added to the empire, Riemann did so with a careful hand, as to not disrupt local culture and traditions, but mostly to establish good trade. He gathered many advisors from the conquered territories to help him figure out how to rule it correctly. Riemann was known as the emperor who focused on his people more than any other. As a result, imperial culture spread across Tamriel, not through forced assimilation, but free will, as citizens came to accept and support the empire by reaping the benefits of free trade, stability, and the development of improved infrastructure. For many years, peace prevailed throughout Tamriel, and many consider his reign to be the golden age of the Second Empire. In time, Riemann's attention came to the unconquered territories in the southeast of the continent. This vast swampland was populated by the reptilian Argonians, created by the Hist, a race of sapient spore trees, which some scholars claim to be the first original life form on Tamriel. The Argonians have a deep connection with their creators, and are often seen as completely alien and strange, even by other Argonians that were raised far from the swamplands and the Hist. At the onset of Riemann's invasion into the Argonian homeland, the Imperial Legion won a great and decisive victory in the Battle of Argonia, as well as in several other clashes, inflicting significant casualties on the Argonians and incorporating much of the territory into the newly named province of Black Marsh. Their successes, however, would come to a halt as the Argonians retreated deep into the swamps in the interior of the province. The Imperial Legion spent the next 3 decades attempting to subjugate Black Marsh in the Blackwater War, sustaining heavy casualties from the Argonians, beasts, and diseases. This would go on until the Argonians abruptly refused to continue fighting, dropping their weapons and going back to farming and fishing, perhaps at the command of their hissed overlords. With this, the exhausted Riemann II declared the official annexation of Black Marsh, thus ending the Blackwater War. Not being content with the conquest of Black Marsh, Riemann turned towards the last unconquered province in Tamriel, Morrowind. The resulting war would last for 80 years and became known as the Fourscore War. This war would devastate both sides and would cost Emperor Riemann II his life in battle against the Dunmer. This war would continue long after his demise, bleeding the empire dry and putting an end to the golden age he worked so very hard to create. Emperor Riemann would be succeeded by his illegitimate son, Brazilas Dor, who would continue the conflict against Morrowind, though the war remained a stalemate throughout his reign. He, in turn, would be succeeded by Riemann III after his sudden death. The fifth emperor of the Second Empire and the Riemann dynasty, Riemann III, continued the war started by his grandfather and namesake, closely advised by his Akaviri potentate, Versidue Shaye. At the Battle of Bodrum, the imperial army was defeated when the commander of the Dunmer army, Vivek, ordered his battle mages to cast spells at a dam built on the Priai River, destroying the dam, washing away the imperial vanguard, and forcing the emperor to order the remains of his army to retreat back to Cyrodiil. However, Riemann's tactically brilliant son, the young Prince Julik, managed to achieve an important strategic victory at the stronghold of Ald-Marach, turning the tide of the war in the Empire's favor yet again. Realizing the war could only bring ruin to Morrowind, Vivek met with Prince Julik to sue for peace. It was eventually agreed that Morrowind would surrender its coastline as well as other strategic fortresses. In return, the Empire would cease all hostilities against Morrowind and allow the nation to expand into the territories of Black Marsh that the Empire deemed unnecessary. However, the treaty would not come to be signed until much later. Prince Julik would be assassinated in Black Marsh, and soon after, the Emperor Riemann himself would meet his end at the hands of the assassins of the Morag Tong. As Riemann had no heirs outside of Julik, the Elder Council would elect his trusted advisor, the Seishi potentate Versidue Shaye, as the acting ruler of the empire. The new de facto leader would honor the Emperor's treaty and sign peace with Morrowind. Emperor Riemann Cyrodiil III, the last of his line, would be buried at Sancre Tor, along with the Amulet of Kings, the symbol of imperial power. Thus, with the fall of the Riemann dynasty, the almost 3 millennia of the First Era come to an end. Defined by earth-shattering cataclysms, wars, epidemics, and the disappearance of entire nations, the first age of a young world would define the geographies and politics of the many ages to come. Thank you, dear friends, for lending me your ear, and until we meet again.